My name is Nikki Patton, and today I will be presenting on Tania Mitchell and her theory on critical service learning. When we think of theorists, we often think of them as being from the past, not necessarily being an active member of society. Tania Mitchell is in the present. She is a modern and relevant theorist who is very much still at work in higher ed and in service. Tania Mitchell is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, which is great because Minnesota is where I live. Currently, she's teaching classes in student affairs. However, she is taking a sabbatical for this school year. She is internationally recognized, particularly for her service learning and her community engagement work. She has written 4 books, many on service learning, and does also frequently speak at different conferences. So her theory on critical service learning starts off by explaining that service learning is nuanced. There could be many people gathered in a room, and none of them could agree on what service learning is or isn't. Tania Mitchell makes the distinction between traditional service learning and critical service learning. She states that a traditional approach that emphasizes service without attention to inequality in a situation, and a critical approach focuses at getting rid of any injustice or taking down any structures that lead to inequality. In other words, traditional service learning doesn't look at the inequality, and critical service learning can't help but look at it. Service learning has come about on college, universities, and campuses as a way to enhance student learning and development. And the goal for critical service learning is just different than the goal for a traditional approach. With traditional service learning, the goal is more so purely education. And with critical service learning, the goal is at achieving the greater good. When it's done in the more traditional way, Mitchell argues that service can actually be patronizing. Often the giver or the server, in this situation would be a student, is very separated from the recipient. There can be this idea that the server is incredibly benevolent and that the recipient cannot survive without their help. In this case, all of the power goes to the server. Mitchell argues that critical service learning requires the use, and therefore development, of critical thinking. People need to use critical thinking to look at the root of the need of the recipient. For example, instead of just working in a soup kitchen a few times a week, critical service learning instead suggests discovering who the soup kitchen serves, what the history is there, what inequalities have led people to the soup kitchen, and how those inequalities could be dismantled. This leads into my next point, which is relationship building. In order to really get to the bottom of the need for service, students need to build strong relationships with their community partner and the people that they're serving. Mitchell accurately argues that a true relationship cannot be formed over a single semester, such as those that are usually used in traditional service learning. Critical service learning works to redistribute power among all of the members of a service learning relationship, including the recipient. And it does this through those authentic relationships and by focusing on a social change perspective. Now, it might seem like critical service learning is clearly the best thing ever, but there are some limitations. For one, it might be more deep and more real than some students are looking for. For example, students might sign up for a history-based service learning class expecting to help at the local homeless shelter and not necessarily wanting to dive deep into local redlining and the reasoning behind it by working with people who maybe, for example, used to live in St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood that was purposefully destroyed by Interstate 94. Mitchell points out that social change-oriented service is naturally more political than traditional notions of service, and because of that, can receive some criticism from those who are worried about indoctrination. Mitchell references work done by Boyle Bays, Wade, and Marullo when stating that there are specific skills, knowledge, and experiences required of students to not only participate in communities, but to also transform them. Community issues and concerns should be seen as at least as equally important as student learning in a critical service learning class. Because of this, it naturally takes on a progressive and liberal agenda, which is another limitation. So, how does this theory of critical service learning look in real life? In her article, Using a Critical Service Learning Approach to Facilitate Civic Identity Development, Mitchell discovers exactly what it means. This studied the impact of critical service learning on civic identity development. Specifically, in order to study the long-term implications of critical service learning, Mitchell decided to study alumni. This case studied and focused on 3 critical service learning focused civic engagement experiences, and each of these experiences utilized a critical service learning pedagogy and sought to help create engaged scholars and people who would work for a better world long after the class was done. She goes deep into the data and the background in her article, but the data in the end revealed that the community engagement and the cohort experiences of all 3 programs were incredibly important to students' learning and experiences. Alumni continued to point to and reflect on these experiences long after they graduated out of the programs. Essentially, the outcome was that experiences were important and they made an impact in the long run. The critical service learning theory created by Tania Mitchell goes a long way to point out the differences between service that is focused on self and service that is focused on others. Mitchell argues that service that is focused on self tends to be more traditional and also more education focused. But service that is focused on others and is more critical and teaches critical thinking can be very influential and impactful, and in the end can create bigger change.